Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be reading from this book, which looks very plain and black, but it is Lost Cities, Ancient Tombs, which I read the first chapter of. You guys loved it, so did I. This book is awesome. Like I've said before in another video, I hate dust jackets and I take it off when I read them, and I forgot to put it back on. That's okay. You guys can figure it out. So we are going to read The Dawn of Culture, 50,000 to 3000 BCE. So let's just dive right in and learn a bit more about lost kingdoms and ancient tombs, lost cities and ancient tombs. So we're going to start with chapter 9, Rock Art of the Aboriginal Dreamtime. This is at least 30,000 BCE in Australia, and it's Aboriginal. More than 100,000 paintings and engravings across Australia represent the world's longest continuing art forms. Aboriginal people have lived in Australia for at least 60,000 years, and for the overwhelming majority of that time they had the continent to themselves. There were once about 250 distinct Aboriginal languages, hundreds more dialects, and many more clans and subgroups. But there is deep spiritual and cultural overlap among them. These people lived for a couple thousand generations in small nomadic bands, as befits a hunter-gatherer existence, moving in their own rhythms about the vast expanse of Australia. Then on April 29th, 1770, British explorer James Cook landed his ship, the Endeavour, on the southeastern shore. The next 2 centuries saw the horror of cultural obliteration, massacres, disease, alcoholism, forced integration, surrender. Aboriginals now make up less than 4% of the Australian population. Many anthropologists credit them with possessing the world's longest enduring religion, as well as the longest continuing art forms. The cross-hatched and dot-patterned painting styles once inscribed in the caves and shelters that make up Australia's 100,000 rock art sites. According to Aboriginal cosmology, all of Earth's surface was once a featureless expanse of mud or clay. Then ancestral beings emerged from beneath the surface or from the sky, assumed the form of an animal or plant or human, and journeyed across the land, performing great deeds of creation, shaping the mud into rivers, hills, islands, and caves, and making the animals and people. This took place in an age known as the Dreamtime. And the path each of these beings took, the countryside they molded before burrowing back into the ground, is called a songline. They bestowed language, law, ritual, and faith. These stories form the basis of Aboriginal life, and through ritual and art, this community continues to interact with the beings from that period of creation. Owlmen, serpent-headed women, spiny anteaters, fish, and spiders are among the figures painted on the walls of caves and cliffs in Australia's rugged top end, where some of the continent's most spectacular images are found. Where tribespeople once met in solemn ritual during the wet seasons, tourists now gather at Burringkoi or Norangi in Kakadu National Park. At least I hope that's how you say those. Busloads of visitors from Darwin regularly reach the stone outcropping to view one of the most beautiful collections of rock art yet documented. One complex cliffside mural of spirits features Namargon, a creation ancestor who holds a lightning bolt in his hands. Backbones and hatching designs of the X-ray art style decorate the bodies. In the part of northwestern Australia known as the Kimberley, natural rock art galleries are decorated with ghostly forms that have human-like heads but no mouths, representing a particular type of ancestral being known as a Wangina. Some Aboriginal groups have resisted the Western framing of these rock art sites as static monuments that should remain untouched for all time. The rock paintings are not merely representations of spiritual beings, but living beings themselves that are still in conversation with the people. Let you look at this art. Isn't that incredible? How interesting. It's like it flows over the rocks, huh? A controversy ensued in 1987 when a group of Nyaran people from the Western Kimberley repainted some rock art images. But the Nyaran leader and artist David Lowell-Jarlai explained in 1988, "Those images were put down for us by our creator, Wangina, so that we would know how to stay alive, make everything grow, and continue what he gave to us in the first place." He added that young people are meant to learn to read these images so that they will take on their responsibilities to the land in adulthood. Those obligations to the land include maintaining and repainting images. Here we go. It was always known that the artwork was old, but just how old? Despite centuries of research by both outsiders and Aboriginal-led teams, rock art sites in Australia have been notoriously difficult to date with scientific methods. It's often hard to get an accurate age for mineral paints because they lack datable carbon. One set of reliably dated engravings, up to 15,000 years old, has been found in northern Queensland's Lower Basin. In 2012, archaeologists obtained a sample from art made with charcoal at the Nwarla Gabarnman Cave in the Arnhem Land, the Northern Territory, and found that those images were around 28,000 years old, making the rock art site the oldest directly dated in Australia. But archaeologists have reason to believe many other sites are much older. At some, they found pieces of red ochre crayons that date back over 50,000 years, which would make them older than the Paleolithic paintings found in European cave sites like Lascaux and Chauvet. Some creative new dating techniques could help scientists get better answers. In 2020, researchers reported that they were able to determine when the slender headdress-wearing Gwian figures of the Kimberley were created. Dating a fossil wasp nest built directly over the art put the date of the figures' creation at about 12,000 years ago. Australia's rock art faces severe threats. Tribes have been displaced from their traditional lands, and development continues to endanger sites. About 1,700 engraved boulders became damaged after they were removed to make way for a gas plant on Western Australia's Burrup Peninsula in the early 1980s. Residents of Western Australia were outraged when reports in 2014 revealed that many Gwian rock paintings had been harmed as a result of the local government's scheduled fire prevention burning strategy. In May 2020, the Rio Tinto company destroyed the 46,000-year-old Juukan Gorge rock shelters in the Pilbara region of Western Australia while expanding an iron ore mine. Some rock art experts complained that Australia has lacked a coordinated approach to document these sites. Others have urged that measures be taken to prevent their deterioration, and that Indigenous artists be encouraged to perpetuate their traditional skills. With adequate protection and periodic restoration, the immortality of such cliffside masterpieces could be assured. Chapter 10. Ice Age Artists. 38,000 BCE. In France, it's the Paleolithic period, representing an explosion in human creativity. The lifelike cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet attest to a world that no longer exists. On a September afternoon in 1940, 4 teens, Marcel Ravida, Georges Agnel, Simon Consat, and Jacques Marceau, made their way through the woods on a hill overlooking Montignac in southwest France. They had come to explore a dark, deep hole one boy had found when his dog Robot fell between the roots of a dead tree. The boys had a knife, a few bits of rope, a homemade oil lamp. They believed the hole could be a rumored secret underground passage to the nearby manor of Lascaux. They tossed a few stones down the hole to judge its depth. The stones fell and rolled a long time. After clearing rocks and vegetation from the entrance, they squeezed through one by one, sliding, tumbling, and beginning to explore. They soon saw lines and spots in red and black. Holding the lamp to examine the walls more closely, they discovered, to their surprise, paintings of bulls and deer. The boys told the schoolmaster, who was so impressed upon visiting the galleries that he sent a telegram about the discovery to Abbé Henri Brieux, the Pope of Prehistory. The site quickly attracted researchers who wanted to excavate. And members of the public who wanted to catch a glimpse of the running horses, swimming deer, wounded bison, and other beings depicted in these wonderfully lifelike paintings, which may be up to 20,000 years old. The collection of paintings in Lascaux, remarkable for their rich detail, are among some 147 prehistoric sites dating from the Paleolithic era, including 24 decorated caves that have been documented in France's Vézère Valley to date. This corner of southwestern Europe seems to have been a hotspot for figurative art. The biggest discovery since Lascaux occurred in southern France in December 1994, when 3 spelunkers named Elliot Brunel, Christian Hilaire, and Jean-Marie Chauvet scrambled through a narrow crevice in the cliff and dropped into a dark entry. They laid eyes on artworks that had not been seen since a rock slide 22,000 years ago closed off entry to the cavern. Which is these over here. So cool. Here, by flickering firelight, prehistoric artists began to draw on this cave's bare walls profiles of cave lions, herds of rhinos and mammoths, magnificent bison, and a chimeric creature, part bison, part woman, conjured from an enormous cone of overhanging rock. Other chambers harbor horses, ibex, and aurochs, an owl traced out of mud by a single finger on a rock wall, an immense bison formed from ochre-soaked handprints, and cave bears walking casually, as if in search of a spot for a long winter's nap. The works are often drawn with nothing more than a single and perfect continuous line. In all, the artists depicted 442 animals over perhaps thousands of years, using nearly 400,000 square feet of cave surface as their canvas. Some animals are solitary, even hidden, but most congregate in great mosaics in the deepest part of the cave. The site, now known as Chauvet Cave, is sometimes considered the Sistine Chapel of prehistory. The first photographs of the place captivated specialists and the public alike. For decades, scholars had theorized that art had advanced in slow stages from primitive scratchings to lively naturalistic renderings. Surely the subtle shading, genius use of perspective, and elegant lines of Chauvet's masterworks placed them at the pinnacle of that progression. Then carbon dates came in, and prehistorians reeled. At about 36,000 years old, approximately twice as old as those in the more famous caves like Lascaux, Chauvet's images represented not the culmination of prehistoric art, but its earliest known beginnings. A few thousand years after anatomically modern humans appeared in Europe, cave painting was as sophisticated as it would ever be. Since its discovery, Chauvet has been ferociously protected by the French Ministry of Culture, which rarely allows visits. Lascaux was closed to the public in 1963 after heritage officials recognized that the presence of visitors expelling carbon dioxide and moisture was damaging the artwork. For a 2015 National Geographic report, journalist Chip Walter was allowed a peek at the artwork in Chauvet and captured the feeling of being inside. The ceiling closes in, and in some places the heavy cave walls crowd close enough to touch my shoulders. Then we enter the belly of an expansive chamber. This is where the cave lions are, and the woolly rhinos, mammoths, and bison, a menagerie of ancient creatures stampeding, battling, stalking in total silence. Outside the cave where the real world is, they are all gone now. The age of these drawings makes youngsters of Egypt's storied pyramids. Yet every charcoal stroke, every splash of ochre looks as fresh as yesterday. Their beauty whipsaws your sense of time. One moment you are anchored in the present, observing coolly. The next you are seeing the paintings as if all other art, all civilization has yet to exist. The search for the world's oldest cave paintings continues. Rock art discovered in the rest of the world has disrupted the belief that visual storytelling emerged first in Europe. On the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, for example, scientists found a chamber of figurative paintings of part human, part animal beings that are estimated to be 44,000 years old, older than any sites located in Europe. Archaeologists look to rock art for clues as to when humans developed self-awareness and modern cognition. Stone tools reveal ancient humans' strategies of survival, but paintings and sculptures with no discernible utilitarian function attest to their ability to grasp more abstract intellectual concepts. Artwork like the ones that decorate Chauvet and Lascaux create such a strong impression on viewers for that reason, even if we cannot reconstruct the cosmology that colored the worldview of these ancient artists. Scholars don't know if art was invented independently many times over, in disparate geographic locations, or if it was a skill developed early in our evolution. Nor have researchers confirmed if it was an ability unique to Homo sapiens, or if Neanderthals were also painters. What we do know is that creativity and the needs for artistic expression run deep into our ancestry. Chapter 11, The Most Ancient Americans. 18,000 BCE, Monteverde, Chile. These are the early peoples of the Americas. Experts once believed that people first came to the Americas 13,000 years ago. Recent discoveries have pushed that date much farther back. New archaeological finds, novel hypotheses, and a trove of genetic data have shed fresh light on who the first Americans were and when they might have come to the Western Hemisphere. But for all that forward motion, what's clearest is that the story of the ancient people who settled a new land is still very much a mystery. For most of the 20th century, the mystery had been assumed more or less solved. In 1908, a cowboy in Folsom, New Mexico found the remains of an extinct subspecies of giant bison that had roamed the area more than 10,000 years ago. Later, museum researchers discovered spear points among the bones, clear evidence that people had been present in North America much earlier than previously believed. Not long after, spear points dating to 13,000 years ago were found near Clovis, New Mexico. What became known as Clovis points were subsequently found at dozens of sites across North America where ancient hunters had killed game. Given that Asia and North America were connected during the last ice age by a broad landmass called Beringia, and that the first Americans appeared to be mobile big game hunters, it was easy to conclude that they'd followed mammoths and other prey out of Asia, across Beringia, and then south through an open corridor between two massive Canadian ice sheets. And given that there is no convincing evidence for human occupation predating Clovis hunters, a new orthodoxy developed. They had been the first Americans. Case closed. That all changed in 1997 when a team of high-profile archaeologists visited a small settlement site in southern Chile called Monteverde. There, U.S. archaeologist Tom Dillahay claimed to have discovered evidence of human occupation dating to more than 14,000 years ago, 1,000 years before Clovis hunters appeared in North America. Theory is at work. Similarly, early dates had been emerging from other sites as well. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, for instance, and Pedra Ferrada in Brazil. But the evidence was controversial. The question of whether humans had arrived in the Americas before the Clovis people was so hotly debated, in fact, that it split New World archaeologists into two deeply entrenched camps. Dillahay was even accused of planting artifacts and fabricating data. But after reviewing the evidence, the expert team concluded it was solid, and the story of the peopling of the Americas was thrown wide open. The site of Monteverde came to light in 1976, when local lumbermen, cutting back the banks of the Chinchilhuapi Creek to widen a trail for their ox carts, unearthed mastodon bones and pieces of wood in the wet peat. The next year, Dillahay, then at the anthropology department at Southern University of Chile in Valdivia, began nearly a decade of excavation with Chilean colleagues. What they uncovered were the traces of a settlement along a creek once lined with evergreens. The inhabitants had hunted mastodons, gathered a bounty of foods, including wild potatoes, bamboos, mushrooms, and juncus seeds, and were able to treat the sick and injured with seaweed, at least 22 varieties of medicinal plants, and analgesic tree leaves imported from the far north. Interesting. In 2013, Delahaye returned to Monteverde and gathered evidence that would introduce a new possible time frame for the site. Radiocarbon dating of fire-charred plants and bones suggests that people had built cooking fires and made stone tools there some 18,500 years ago, or even earlier. Fortunately, many of those perishable remains were preserved because Monteverde died a sudden death. For unknown reasons, perhaps increased rainfall, the water table rose abruptly. Water pooled at the camp, forcing the residents to leave. Soon a peat bog smothered the campsite, protecting it from bacterial attack and destructive changes in humidity. The peat also preserved one human footprint, about 5 inches long, probably left in the sandy mud as the Monteverdeans were moving on. That footprint made Monteverde human for me, recalled Rick Gore, the writer National Geographic sent to report on the investigation. I saw a child, rain-soaked and crying, running after its mother as she abandoned the settlement. The steps of that child insisted that someone like us had indeed reached the forests of Chile surprisingly long ago. In the years since the initial Monteverde bombshell, no one has been able to know for sure how people came to the southern reaches of South America at such an early date. But the original question, was Clovis first, has been answered repeatedly. Some sites providing evidence have been known and studied for years and have gained fresh credibility in the wake of Monteverde's acceptance. But there have been new finds as well. One site, in the Texas Hill Country north of Austin, is located along a tiny stream called Buttermilk Creek. Archaeologists uncovered more than 16,000 pre-Clovis artifacts, including stone blades, spear points, and chips, suggesting that people settled there as early as 15,500 years ago. Another site in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula lies inside an immense submerged cavern nicknamed Hoyo Negro, or Black Hole. There, a team of Mexican divers found a bed of prehistoric bones, including at least one nearly complete human skeleton, that of a teenage girl who fell into the hole and died some 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. The newest archaeological data comport with an increasingly important line of evidence in our understanding of the peopling of the Americas. In recent years, geneticists have compared the DNA of modern Native Americans with that of other populations around the world. Based on mutation rates in human DNA, they concluded that the ancestors of Native Americans were Asians who separated from other Asian populations and remained isolated for about 10,000 years. During that time, they developed unique genetic signatures that only Native Americans currently possess. Those same genetic markers were found in the DNA recovered from two ancient sources, the Yucatan cave skeleton and the remains of a child buried 12,600 years ago in western Montana, in a place now called the Anzac Site. And then there are fossilized human feces, surely the most indelicate evidence of pre-Clovis occupation in North America. In 2008, Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon reported that he'd found human coprolites, or ancient excrement, dating between 14,000 and 15,000 years ago, in a series of shallow caves overlooking an ancient lake bed near the town of Paisley. Jenkins speculates that the people who left them might have made their way inland from the Pacific by way of the Columbia or Klamath rivers. As at Monteverde and the Buttermilk Creek site, people living by the lake seem to have settled in, comfortable with their environment and adept at exploiting it. All this suggests that long before the Clovis culture began spreading across North America, the land hosted diverse communities of humans, people who may have arrived in any number of migrations by any number of routes. Some may even have come in such small numbers that traces of their existence will never be found. There's a whole lot of stuff that we don't know and may never know, said David Meltzer, an archaeologist at Southern Methodist University. But we're finding new ways to find things, and new ways to find things out. Next we have Chapter 12, the world's oldest temple, circa 9,600 BCE, Anatolia, Turkey, prehistoric. Discoveries at the site of Gobekli Tepe, a religious sanctuary built by hunter-gatherers, suggest the urge to worship sparked civilization. Most of the world's great religious centers, past and present, have been destinations for pilgrimages. Think of the Vatican, Mecca, Jerusalem, and other monuments for spiritual travelers who often come from great distances. The prehistoric site of Gobekli Tepe, or Belly Hill in Turkish, may be the first of them all. Its early date, in fact, suggests that the human sense of the sacred and love of a good spectacle may have given rise to civilization itself. What archaeologists have uncovered stands atop a mound that rises 50 feet above the countryside. With stone pillars arranged into a set of rings, it is vaguely reminiscent of Stonehenge, except that this was built much earlier, with the limestone pillars bearing bas-reliefs of animals, a cavalcade of gazelles, snakes, foxes, scorpions, and ferocious wild boars. The assemblage was created some 11,600 years ago. So far as we know, the pillars represent the first structure human beings put together that was bigger and more complicated than a hut. Check that out. At that time, much of the human race lived in small nomadic bands that survived by foraging for plants and hunting wild animals. Construction of the site would have required more people coming together in one place than had likely occurred before. Amazingly, the temple's builders were able to cut, shape, and transport 16-ton stones hundreds of feet, despite having no wheels or beasts of burden. Discovering that hunter-gatherers had constructed Gobekli Tepe was like finding someone had built a 747 in a basement with an X-Acto knife. My colleagues, we all thought, what? How? Said archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the first director of excavations there. In the 1960s, archaeologists from the University of Chicago surveyed the region and concluded that Gobekli Tepe was of little interest. Disturbance was evident at the top of the hill, but they attributed it to the activities of a Byzantine-era military outpost. Here and there were broken pieces of limestone they thought were gravestones. In 1994, Schmidt came across the Chicago researchers' brief description of the hilltop and decided to check it out. Within minutes of arriving, he realized that he was looking at a place where scores or even hundreds of people had worked in millennia past. The limestone slabs were not Byzantine graves, but something much older. He began digging the very next year. Inches below the surface, shovels struck an elaborately fashioned stone, then another and another, a ring of standing pillars. As the months and years went by, Schmidt's team, a shifting crew of German and Turkish graduate students and 50 or more local villagers, found a second circle of stones, then a third, and then more. Geomagnetic surveys in 2003 revealed at least 20 rings piled together higgledy-piggledy under the earth. The circles follow a common design. All are made from limestone pillars shaped like giant spikes or capital T's. Blade-like, the pillars are easily 5 times as wide as they are deep. The tallest are 18 feet in height and weigh 16 tons. They stand an arm span or more apart, interconnected by low stone walls. In the middle of each ring are 2 taller pillars, their thin ends mounted in shallow grooves cut into the floor. Puzzle piled upon puzzle as the excavation continued. For reasons yet unknown, the rings at Gobekli Tepe seem to have regularly lost their power. Every few decades, people buried the pillars and put up new stones, a second smaller ring inside the first. Sometimes later they installed a third. Then the whole assemblage would be filled with debris, and an entirely new circle was created nearby. The site may have been built, filled in, and built again for centuries. Archaeologists are still excavating the site and debating its meaning. What they know is that the place is the most significant, and a volley of unexpected findings that have overturned earlier ideas about our species' deep past. Scholars long thought that when hunter-gatherers settled down and started growing crops, The resulting food surplus made it possible for people to organize complex societies. Gobekli Tepe calls that into question. Before he died in 2014, Schmidt argued that it might have worked the other way around. The labor force needed to build the enclosures pushed people to develop agriculture as a way to feed workers. Indeed, scientists now believe that one center of agriculture arose in southern Turkey, well within trekking distance of Gobekli Tepe, at exactly the time the temple was at its height. Some archaeologists believe Gobekli Tepe was a regional gathering place. Back then, people would have to meet regularly to keep the gene pool fresh and exchange information, said Jens Notruff, an archaeologist who has been working at the site. One imagines chanting and drumming, the animals on the great pillars seeming to move and flickering torchlight. Surely they were feasts. Schmidt's team uncovered stone basins that could have been used for beer. The temple was a spiritual locus, but it may have also been the Neolithic version of Disneyland. Today, about a tenth of the 22-acre site is open to the sky. As archaeologists continue to work, new discoveries may well change the current understanding of the site's importance. Still, after years of digging, Schmidt believed he understood why hunter-gatherers settled down in the first communities. I think what we are learning, he said, is that civilization is a product of the human mind. Next chapter, 13, the first true city, circa 4500 BCE in Iraq, Sumerian. From the earliest known writing to pioneering urban planning, Uruk is the city of firsts. The first mass-produced product, the first stone architecture, the first ziggurat, the first written words. For the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia, Uruk was the urban center of their world. For archaeologists and historians, it's one of history's most important archaeological finds, not just for its significance as the first true city in the world, but also for the first of its kind evidence of some of the building blocks of modern civilization. The city's innovations were emulated in surrounding settlements, but for proof of its ongoing influence, you need only look at the structure of any modern city, the production floor of a factory, the letters in our alphabet, and our file cabinets of contracts. Located a few hours' drive southeast of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq, where it is known as Warqa, the city was a work of ancient Sumer people. Uruk was built in the 5th millennium BCE and shows signs of continuous habitation for 5,000 years before being abandoned in the 1st century CE. In 1849, British explorer William Kenneth Loftus began initial excavations there. I know of nothing more exciting or impressive than the first sight of one of these Chaldean piles, looming in solitary grandeur from the surrounding plains and marshes, he wrote of the city's ziggurats, which are visible for miles. Of all the desolate sights I ever beheld, that of Warqa incomparably surpasses all. Nonetheless, Loftus soon abandoned the project. In 1912, a group of archaeologists financed by an association of German explorers began an excavation staffed by Bedouin laborers. As the dig progressed, they uncovered a long series of uruks, each built atop the remains of the last for nearly 1,000 years. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, a great wall of perhaps 306 million bricks were built around the city. Some legends say the wall was built by Gilgamesh, the protagonist of the first surviving work of epic literature. The prologue includes a tour of the city. The outer wall, where the cornice runs, it shines with the brilliance of copper, and the inner wall, it has no equal. Touch the threshold, it is ancient. Climb upon the wall of Uruk, walk around it, I say. Regard the foundation terrace and examine the masonry. Is it not burnt brick and good? Construction was certainly an undertaking of epic proportions. Historians calculate that a force of 1,000 laborers working 6 months a year would have needed 13.5 years to complete the wall. The city consisted of 2 sections, the Anu district and the Yana district, each dedicated to Sumerian gods. The structures weren't built at random. Evidence points to an advanced planning and construction process. Uruk's infrastructure included irrigation works, food warehouses, homes, and businesses. Researchers believe canals full of water from a branch of the Euphrates River once crisscrossed the city, creating a kind of Amsterdam on the sand. Uruk also contained temples, which are thought to have functioned both as places of worship and of government. Many artifacts unearthed at Uruk show skilled craftsmanship and artistic expression, but archaeologists have also found evidence of mass production there. Cheap, similar-sized bevel-rimmed bowls, thought to have been used as vessels for daily rations of grain, then discarded in waste pits. The consistency in size and design means the vessels were manufactured from the same mold or model, which could quickly be replicated to distribute to a large population. It's really interesting. Archaeologists have unearthed nearly 5,000 clay tablets, most from apparent waste piles, that recorded financial transactions with pictographs and signs thought to be the world's first numerals. You can see here. Sumerian accountants also used clay tokens to represent things like jars of oil or kinds of livestock. The cash is an ancient example of bureaucracy still with us today, accounting and contracts. One clay tablet records the world's oldest known mathematical problem, dated to the 4th millennium BCE. Researchers say it shows a numeral system based on the number 60. It documents calculations related to length and area. Perhaps the most fascinating innovation at Uruk was the written language called cuneiform. The inhabitants began writing inscriptions and pictographs, small pictures or icons that could be strung together to create a narrative. Over centuries, pictographs gradually abstracted into the simpler markings of cuneiform, signs representing syllables that can be pieced together to write words and sentences. Writing enabled dissemination of knowledge far beyond Uruk's walls and was adopted by the Akkadians, Babylonians, Sumerians, and Assyrians to write their own languages. Scribes wrote in cuneiform for more than 3 millennia, offering a precious window into the poetry, laws, medical receipts, scientific observations, and bookkeeping of the world's first cities. Chapter 14. The Fate of Otzi the Iceman. Circa 3300 BCE, the Otzi Alps in Italy, Neolithic. Frozen in time under a glacier in the Alps, this Neolithic hunter felled by a foe's arrow, the oldest intact human ever discovered. When German couple Helmut and Erika Simon set off for a hike in the Otzi Alps on Italy's border with Austria on September 19, 1991, they likely expected to see some stunning scenery. But as they roamed slightly off the trail, Erika instead spotted something that would stun the world. Sticking unexpectedly out of the ice in a rocky hollow was a small head atop a pair of shoulders. Was it a victim of a hiking accident? Over the following 4 days, a well-intentioned small crowd, including hikers, police officers, and a forensics team, overran the discovery site at 10,530 feet. They used implements ranging from ice picks to ski poles to a jackhammer to extricate the body and several of the deceased's belongings, including an unusual axe from the icy tomb. The incredibly well-preserved body had been naturally mummified, a clue that this was not a recent traveler through this alpine area. There he is. Wow. The body and belongings were transported to the University of Innsbruck's Institute for Prehistory and Early History. There, archaeologist Konrad Spindler took one look at the salvage stacks and knew this Iceman was a time traveler from the Copper Age. Indeed, further investigation revealed that 5,300-year-old Otzi the Iceman, named for the Otzi Valley near his death site, is the oldest intact human ever found. Not since Howard Carter unlocked the tomb of Tutankhamun in the early 1920s had an ancient human so seized the world's imagination, wrote mountaineer David Roberts. Over the ensuing 3 decades, scientists have used an array of high-tech tools, including 3D endoscopy and DNA analysis, to examine the Iceman exhaustively. removing him only when necessary from the refrigerated chamber in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where he has resided since 1998. They have refined his biography in exquisite detail. What at first appeared to be a tale of a solitary Neolithic hunter overtaken by the elements has morphed into a riveting murder mystery in which a foe rather than the weather caught up with the Iceman. Nature did play a starring role, however, in performing one of the best embalming jobs in the history of human remains. The frigid glacial environment of the Otzi Alps tucked the Iceman in like a cold, wet blanket, immobilizing and preserving his body in snow, ice, and glacial meltwater. The little hollow protected his lifeless form from the bone-grinding action of the Niederjog Glacier, which passed just a few feet overhead for the next 5,300 years. In March 1991, a dust storm in the Sahara blew particles as far north as the Alps. As they soaked in the sun's rays, they triggered an unprecedented melting of the glaciers, including the portion covering the Iceman's final resting place. The Simons happened upon him at just the right time, for 3 days later another snowfall would have buried him anew. Wow. Thorough examinations of the Iceman showed that he was missing only his hair, toenails, all but one fingernail, and an outer layer of skin. His small, sinewy frame was covered in more than 50 tattoos, made by rubbing charcoal into the fine cuts in the skin. The dark lines and crosses were mostly located on the joints and along the back, parts of the body prone to injury or pain. This has led some researchers to believe that the tattoos marked acupuncture points. If so, the Iceman must have needed a lot of treatment, which isn't so surprising given what scientists have learned about his age and ailments. He was in his mid-40s, a rather elderly man for his times. He had worn joints, hardened arteries, and gallstones. His right hand and wrist bore cuts of the kind made by a hatchet, inflicted just days before he died. Furthermore, the Iceman's gut contained the eggs of parasitic worms. He seems to have been the earliest known human infected by the bug that causes Lyme disease. He had alarming levels of arsenic in his system, probably due to working with metal ores. He also had advanced gum disease and tooth decay. Although these health factors would have made the Iceman's life uncomfortable, they did not kill him. In 2001, an Italian radiologist x-rayed the Iceman's chest and detected an object his earlier colleagues had missed, a stone arrowhead, smaller than a quarter, lodged beneath the Iceman's left shoulder blade. This casual discovery instantly turned an inexplicable death more than 5,000 years ago into archaeology's most fascinating cold case, journalist Stephen Hall reported for National Geographic. The forensic evidence became even more intriguing in 2005, when new CT scan technology revealed that the sharpened arrowhead, probably flint, had made a half-inch gash in the Iceman's left subclavian artery. Such a serious tear in the main vessel carrying oxygenated blood from the heart to the left arm would have caused uncontrollable bleeding that would almost immediately have been fatal. Since that astonishing breakthrough, scientists have pieced together the Iceman's last days. Based on isotopes found in his teeth and bones and microscopic chips of mica in his intestines, researchers think he likely started his journey from the lower Val Venosta. He ascended a forested path into the mountains in the late spring or early summer, when pollen from blooming hop hornbeam flowers dusted the water and food he consumed. He wore 3 layers of garments and sturdy shoes with bearskin soles. He was well equipped with a flint-tipped dagger, a fire-starting kit, and a birch bark container holding embers wrapped in maple leaves. He also carried the precious copper-bladed axe, which indicated he was likely a person of considerable social significance. Yet he also headed into a harsh wilderness, curiously unarmed. Only 2 of the 14 arrows in his deerskin quiver were completed. The 6-foot longbow he carried was yet to be notched and strung with a cord in his quiver, now considered the oldest known bowstring in the world. It appears he hiked in and out of pine forests at higher altitudes. When he reached a mountain pass now known as Tisenjok, He likely paused to rest after completing a vertical climb of 6,500 feet from the valley below and to enjoy a meal. He did not know that the greasy, filling repast of ibex and grain would be his last. An attacker positioned behind Ambulow's target fired the arrow that struck the Iceman's left shoulder blade. Within minutes, the Iceman collapsed, lost consciousness, and bled out. Scientists suspect his assailant may have struck the back of his head as a final coup de grace. The shaft of the arrow was broken, suggesting Otzi struggled to extract it, or the killer removed it from the scene. For all the answers that scientists have found about the Iceman, many questions still remain. Did the cuts on his hand and wrist result from an assault by younger rivals? What drove him up into the Alps so lightly armed? Who killed this elder and why? Although not a single grunt or cry has passed through the Iceman's mummified lips in more than 5,000 years, the ongoing investigation continues to reveal new and startling things about life and death in the Stone Age. Chapter 15. If Stones Could Speak. Circa 3000 BCE, Wiltshire, England, Neolithic. Archaeologists have identified the homes and the quarries of the builders of Stonehenge, completely changing the interpretation of England's most famous prehistoric monument. When archaeologist Michael Parker Pearson launched the multi-year Stonehenge Riverside project in 2003 at Durrington Walls in England, he and his team hoped that the Neolithic site on the Salisbury Plain would have an avenue connecting it to the River Avon, just like Stonehenge, its famous neighbor less than 2 miles away. After all, scientists had known since the early 1800s that Durrington Walls was also a henge, a circular earthen ditch and bank monument. It was later discovered to be the largest known henge in Britain. Subsequent excavations revealed that 2 timber circles once stood within the circle. They might have served as monuments or ceremonial centers. Perhaps the archaeologists would uncover other similarities and connections between Durrington Walls and Stonehenge. To their great satisfaction, the team did uncover a broad roadway 90 feet wide and 560 feet long that led from the eastern entrance of the Durrington Walls henge to the river. As they excavated along the road, they made an even greater discovery: a cluster of 7 small Neolithic houses. The tiny wattle and daub dwellings, measuring roughly 16 by 16 feet, had central hearths and clay floors, some with indentations of heels and maybe buttocks. 5 of the houses showed evidence of furniture, including slot marks for the edges of wooden beds. Remains of a cooking area lay to one side, and food waste was found inside and outside the houses. Parker Pearson and the team realized the tremendous importance of the artifacts. They represented the village of the builders of Stonehenge. More than 1 million people each year visit Stonehenge, the most famous relic of prehistory in Europe, and one of the best known, most completed monuments in the world. Legends and theories abound about this mysterious 4,500-year-old site, that the wizard Merlin created it with the help of a giant, that aliens gave humans the technical know-how to build it, and so on. Over the decades, scientists have made great strides in their understanding of the extraordinary feat of prehistoric engineering. What was once viewed as standing in glorious isolation is now believed to be at the heart of a larger, elaborately sculpted, and historically rich landscape. This is really all one monument complex, said Michael Parker Pearson. Durrington Walls and Stonehenge are not 2 separate cultures in society. This is the same community. The iconic outer Sarson Circle at Stonehenge took shape in about 2500 BCE as the tall sandstone slabs were erected and the cross pieces were set in place, affixed by mortise and tenon joints taken straight from carpentry. On the summer solstice, the sun rises just to the left of the heel-stone along the avenue to the entrance, and on the winter solstice the sun would have set between the uprights of the tallest trilithon, which has since partially collapsed, and into the rock known as the altar stone. There's one of the little houses. But there is much more to Stonehenge, it turns out. Some 500 years earlier, a circular earthen ditch and bank monument, 375 feet across, was cut into the chalky ground, together with a ring of pits now called the Aubrey Holes. Parker Pearson and his team excavated one of those pits and discovered hints that it may have served as a hole for a bluestone, one of the megaliths that were moved inside the circle of Sarsons during a later remodeling. Also, Parker Pearson was able to track down the quarries where the bluestones were extracted, following up on the work of an early 20th century geologist that identified the source of the bluestones as the Preseli Hills in western Wales. But that source was 180 miles away. Why hadn't the builders of Stonehenge used local stone? Part of the mystery was solved in the team's 2021 publication of evidence suggesting that the bluestones may once have formed a henge in Wales. The site at Wanman that has toppled bluestones, as well as empty sockets forming a circle that uniquely matches the earthen ditch enclosing Stonehenge. No other henge in Britain has those dimensions. Also, the entrance at Wanman aligns with sunrise on the summer solstice, as it does at Stonehenge. The Welsh Monument stood for 400 years until some of the local population migrated to Durrington Walls and transported the stones to Stonehenge. What prompted the move is unknown, but it would have been an arduous undertaking, given that each stone weighs some 3 tons. At Durrington Walls, surveys have shown that the village had as many as 300 houses, making it the largest such Neolithic site found in Britain. The isotope analysis of bones found there revealed that grown animals were brought to the site from places across western and northern Britain and Wales. Parker Pearson thinks that large groups came together from across the land to share in the enormous undertaking of constructing Stonehenge, as well as its timber counterpart at Durrington Walls. The monoliths from Wanman likely account for only a small portion of the 80 or more bluestones at Stonehenge, and he believes that the sandstones too were likely transported from earlier sites. According to Parker Pearson's theory, Durrington Walls was the domain of the living, while Stonehenge was dedicated to the dead, and the two were linked by seasonal processions along a route formed by the carefully aligned avenues and the river. Stonehenge is in fact the largest cemetery in Britain from its time. Archaeologists have discovered the cremated remains of as many as 150 individuals, mostly men but also women and children. They date between 2600 and 2500 BCE, the era when Durrington Walls was inhabited. Parker Pearson believes that Stonehenge's relocated bluestones may have been a link to Welsh ancestors, the memory of a world before the migration. The discoveries that continue to be made on the Salisbury Plain and beyond underscore how much may yet be revealed by archaeologists uncovering clues long hidden in the ancient landscape. And lastly, I believe this is the last chapter. Masterpieces of the Sahara. 12,000 to 7,000 BCE, the Sahara, Northern Africa, Neolithic. Stunning paintings and engravings on rock walls of the Sahara recall a time when this desert was teeming with life. One could hardly imagine a more desolate place than Sistine, a devil's garden of grotesquely shaped rock, heat, wind, and sand. Night brings biting cold to an eerie moonscape, yet this remote massif in Algeria is enlivened by some 15,000 paintings and many more engravings. I consider it the world's greatest collection of prehistoric art, stated French explorer Henri Lot. The very name Tisili-Niger, Plateau of the Rivers, evokes a time when the Sahara blossomed with life. As the last ice age waned 12,000 years ago, a shift in weather patterns brought a moist climate to North Africa, making it a far more hospitable place than it is today. The region was once home to Neolithic people who collected grains, hunted buffalo with bows and arrows, and drove cattle over grasslands where giraffes browsed and hippos wallowed in lakes. That abundance and vitality of this lost landscape is preserved in the region's art. The local Algerian population had always known of the artwork in their midst, but Europeans didn't learn of it until the mid-19th century. The ethnic Tuareg who worked as guides described the location of some of the paintings, which were soon recorded and surveyed in German, French, and Swiss reports. In the 1930s, Lote was among the early Western researchers to see the paintings. Since that first visit, he knew these artworks should be documented and publicized. But 2 decades passed before he could mount an expedition to study the mysterious scenes. Traveling from the Algerian oasis village of Djennet with a 30-camel caravan, Lote led a team of artists on an arduous 2-week trail to Tassili. As they washed the dust-covered rocks, a damaging practice now forbidden, they were stunned by the vivid colors. The Tassili painters favored shades of yellow, red, and brown, made by mixing ochre with a liquid, which they applied with feathers or animal hair brushes. To make reproductions, the team fought the wind to tape transparent paper over the paintings for tracing. From those, they made watercolor copies of 800 major works. Though some of Lote's ideas and methods are considered controversial today, his publications about the Tassili artwork and a 1950s exhibition of reproductions at the Louvre helped introduce African rock images to the rest of the world and helped raise their reputation to the level of fine art. Indeed, David Coulson, founder of the Nairobi-based Trust for African Rock Art, wrote that when he first saw a Tassili engraving known as the Crying Cows, he was stunned by its almost Picassoan sophistication. In a 1999 report for National Geographic, he continued, "The cattle seemed to emerge, horns first, from the rock face on which they were carved some 7,500 years ago. The artist chose his canvas carefully, looking for a surface that would catch the sun's rays and create depth and the illusion of motion through shadow. At the right time of year, as the light plays across this engraving, you can almost see the cattle move." So I'm finding like tiny cat hairs on the book. Look at this giraffe. Wow, that's so cool. Tassili, covering an area of more than 27,000 square miles, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but across the wider Sahara region there are likely thousands more rock art sites. It has been difficult to date these artworks with scientific methods, but researchers have established a basic chronology based on the content, archaeological context, and superimposition of the paintings and engravings. A 4,000-year period, starting 12,000 years ago, known as the Bubulus period, was dominated by engravings of large game animals. Then about 9,000 years ago, overlapping with the end of the Bubulus period, representations of people ushered in what experts called the Roundhead period. By about 7,000 years ago, domesticated livestock entered the scene, a momentous change immortalized in an art of the pastoral period. Coulson has led various efforts to preserve rock art in the Sahara, including an operation to make a silicone impression of stunning rock giraffes in Niger that are between 9,000 and 7,000 years old. Their mold revealed small details, such as a line leading from the muzzle of each giraffe to a tiny human figure. No way. Good. Huh. Interesting. The sheer size of the Sahara, 3.5 million square miles, and thousands of years of migration to and from the region make it difficult to track down the rock artists' descendants. Fortunately, some of the customs they chronicled, such as body painting, are easier to trace. Coulson noted striking similarities between the traditional clay and water body paint patterns than clay and water body painting patterns that the Surma of southern Ethiopia used to intimidate an opponent during ritual battles, and the patterns in the massive engravings he saw on the Ennedi Massif in Chad, with human figures as tall as 9 feet. Some Algerian Tuareg now act as custodians of Tassili and Azur, or serve as tourism guides. Unlike Lote, today's archaeologists are more likely to seek a collaborative partnership with the local population to advocate for the urgent preservation of these unique sites scattered across ethnic lines and national borders, and vast areas vulnerable to looters and weathering. Africa's rock art is the common heritage of all Africans, but it is more than that, said Nelson Mandela in 2005. It is the common heritage of humanity. That's what we'll end tonight. Next, we're headed off to the pyramids. Very exciting. you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope you have a very good night.